Hi everyone, Nick DeCourcy from Bright Ideas Agency here. How many webinars have you attended recently? And on what platforms were they hosted? I'm going to guess that very few of you put Microsoft Teams at the top of the list. And I think that's a great shame, because in my view, the Teams webinar feature is one of the most undervalued and underused features that we have in Microsoft 365. So this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at the Teams webinar feature. But as an advocate for supercharging your productivity using the Power Platform, I'm going to be looking at how we can utilize Power Apps and Power Automate to add some capabilities that aren't available out of the box. So let's take a look at this very simple Canvas Power App. I've got my webinars on one side of my screen in a gallery, and I've got my registered attendees on the other side of my screen in another gallery. And by selecting the various webinars, I can see the people who have registered onto that particular webinar. And then I can select individual or multiple attendees, and I can send them an email directly from here. It really isn't a very complicated app at all to put together. And what I'm going to focus on in this video is how I went about getting this data into one place so that I could build this app and display these webinars alongside one another. And just one caveat to what I'm going to go through in the video before I start is that a lot of what I'm going to cover here is using features that are undocumented by Microsoft, which means that they could really change at any time and it would break these solutions. So while hopefully this video offers you some good ideas around your personal or team productivity options using Power Automate and Power Apps, I wouldn't recommend these solutions for anything that's mission critical or enterprise-wide. So let's just jump over to Teams and reacquaint ourselves with webinars and how they work. So in our normal Teams calendar view, there are two ways to create a webinar. You can either use this drop-down next to New Meeting and create a webinar from there, but with any meeting you create, you have this Require Registration option. And if you select either for people in your org or for everyone, then after a couple of seconds this box appears at the top that allows you to customize a registration form. And there is no difference between starting from the calendar and creating a webinar and doing this to any other Teams meeting. And really the only difference between a standard Teams meeting and a webinar is that you have this registration wrapper around it that enables people to self-service the registration process as opposed to you having to send them an invite. In terms of the actual features of the meeting itself, those are just certain meeting policies that are set differently by default on a webinar to a normal meeting. And by playing around with the meeting options, then you can certainly set up any meeting to behave very similarly to how a webinar would behave. So if we jump into this view registration form, these are really the options that you have available to you. You can upload an image if you want an image on your form. You can set a title for the webinar, which is different to the meeting title that you set in Teams. A description, you can add information about the speakers, and you have this form on the right hand side. So first name, last name and email are required, and you can't change these, you can't get rid of them. But you can add from this predetermined list of questions that are available, and you can also ask custom questions so long as the answers that you want can either be an input standard line of text or a choice field. Those are the only options that you've got there. And once you've set up your form as you want it, you save your form. Once you've saved that form and sent your Teams meeting request, the registration link that you copy from here will be available to anyone you send it to, and you can use whatever communication method works best for you to get that registration link out to people. And from the user perspective, once they click on one of those registration links, they're taken to a form like this, where they can register their intent to come to the webinar, and once they hit register now, they're sent an email from Teams that pops up as your tenant name. So make sure your tenant name makes some sense in relation to where people think they're going to get that email from, and then they get a join link in there, and that's the only communication they get about the webinar that they've registered for. So if we jump over to a different user that has a series of webinars already set up, let's take a look at what this looks like from the organizer perspective. So we've got 3 webinars in our calendar. 2 of them have already gone by and 1 of them is upcoming. So let's first of all look at the upcoming one. We just open this. You'll note that we have the attendance tab here, and in that attendance tab you can get some useful information about the particular webinar, including how many times the registration page has been viewed, who has registered. If there's anyone who has cancelled, that would also be here as well. And you can't do anything with this information from here. The only thing that you can really do is download a CSV file, which if we just open that quickly, so that's the information that you get. So it's not very neat and easy to use in there. So let's just jump back out of this. We'll close that and we'll head into one of the webinars that we've already hosted. And exactly the same here. You have an attendance tab, but some added information. You can see the times that the meeting occurred. You can see all that information that was already in your meeting previously that you saw, but you can see when people joined, when they left, how long they were in there for, and again you can download that information as a CSV, and again it's formatted very similarly to the one that we just saw, so there isn't much that you can do with that without a little bit of manipulation. So that's really what the teams look like from within there, and it's a nice set of features. It's particularly nice given that the vast majority of licenses that you would have include this feature just in that normal license cost, and with a lot of Microsoft's competitors, either competitors to Teams or specific webinar software, there's quite significant additional license costs in getting these sorts of features available. So certainly if you're just doing a few webinars or just starting out as a small business, this might be an option that you want to look at. But it's certainly true to say that it's a little bit limiting. Those pieces of data that you've got around who has registered, it would be nice if you were able to do something useful with those. Like for example, send reminder emails, send a survey in follow-up to those people who attended a webinar, add them automatically to your CRM system. All of these things would be nice to have and would really make webinars fit into the Microsoft 365 ecosystem a little bit better. So at least the question of, well, what happens to all of that data once it appears in Teams webinars, and what can we do with it? And that has been an interesting journey to go on to find out how to use that data. And it's not something that Microsoft has a lot of information on, but there are certain users out there, MVPs, etc., that have written about this a little bit. So I started off with this article from Tony Redmond that looked into where does this data live, and then Chris Hord also wrote a little bit similarly around, well, what can we do with Teams data, and then there was a useful video from Stephen Collier as well that I referred to that has some interesting information around this. But the end result of at least a couple of those resources was to automate processes based on each webinar as opposed to all of your webinars together, which didn't really seem that useful to me. So let's just go back to taking a look at our teams. So we'll jump back over to this account, and I want to show you where this data goes. So you'll be familiar with Microsoft Lists, and you may have seen that you don't necessarily see it under recent lists, but if you take a look at all of your lists and you've set up some webinars, you'll see these strange lists that are called event, questionnaire, and speaker. And actually what Teams does is, for every webinar you set up, it establishes 3 lists in your OneDrive. This event list is the details of the webinar itself. The questionnaire list is the details of the people that have registered. And the speaker list, we're not going to see any data in these because I haven't added any data in, but this would be the information about the speakers on your event if you add that in there. And so for every single webinar you create, you get 3 lists. But you can see that the name of the webinar is not in the name of the list. What you've got is event and this kind of GUID number that you've got beyond it, and the only consistent thing is that you do have the same GUID for each of your webinars, and you've got the event or questionnaire or speaker prefix to that. I know in Stephen Collier's video, for example, he suggested that you could go into one of these lists and just as you normally would, you could go and you could create a flow and you could automate some processes. So when a new item is added into your list, you could send yourself an email or send someone an email. But frankly, there is no easy way to find which list relates to which webinar. So I was really interested in can we do better? Is it possible to join all of this information together and automate these processes in some ways? So the way this works is that these lists live within your OneDrive, and OneDrive is essentially a SharePoint site, your own SharePoint site collection that you have, and it'll always be your tenant, my.sharepoint.com, personal, and then your username. And you can see we're under lists here, but if I remove that and just reload, you can see that suddenly magically we're in OneDrive. So this is all in the same place, and it makes a lot of sense because your webinar information is your information, and under the way that Microsoft 365 works, your personal information sits under your OneDrive. So this all makes very logical sense. But how do we join it all together? Well, what I ended up with was creating 2 Excel spreadsheets under OneDrive, and then using Power Automate to enable me to collate together the information that we collect in these lists to do with each of my webinars, and then to collect together each of my attendees using the name of the list that's related to the webinar itself as a key for these, so that we can go back and connect those data points together. And then using the wonders of Power Automate, I went through all of my lists under OneDrive and created this data all in one place. So what does that actually look like? So what we did was created a manual flow, and then created a series of variables that we needed. Getting my profile, there's actually a my site data point under my profile, which is the location of your OneDrive. And then because OneDrive is essentially within SharePoint, you can use the get lists action on your site address, which displays all of the lists that exist under your under your OneDrive. And utilizing the output of that, you can find those lists that start with event underscore, and you can find those lists that start with questionnaire underscore, which are the pertinent data to this process. So once you've got all of that and you have an array of your pertinent lists, so you know which lists you want to look at, it really is just a simple process to get the items out of each list based on the name of that list or the ID of that list, to get a JSON response out of that, and then to go ahead and, depending on which piece of data you've actually collected, as if we jump back over to the lists that we were in, you will see that in the event list, for example, there are 3 rows that are created. There's one that has the event details, there's one that has the event metadata, and the only column that has any data in there on any of these lists is this event metadata column, and then another row which is your registration page views count, which is over here, and again that never appears up here, that always appears down here. So the fact that there are 3 different rows and we want all of that data to appear on one row for that webinar means that there's a few hoops that you have to jump through in order to get the right data into the right place, and that's really based upon these columns here, which tell you what type of data is in each row. And then exactly the same thing for the attendees. The attendees are a little bit more straightforward in that you have the same data essentially for each one, in terms of there is just one row per attendee. But the attendee spreadsheet is also a little bit more complicated in that you have different questions depending on what items you've selected on the registration page. So you only have columns for the questions that you've selected, but because you can select columns or questions on a webinar by webinar basis, this list is going to change the columns that it has available to it depending on which webinar it is. So you cannot simply grab the information out of that list and dump it into Excel, because the columns are going to be different for each of your lists. So if you want to capture all the data, then you have to do something with it. So using this parse JSON action, you're actually able to eliminate that variability, because the parse JSON is simply going to, depending on the schema that you use, is going to give you an empty field if it doesn't find that field there in the response from get item. So it still gives you something that you can add into your spreadsheet even if it is empty. So that all said and done, what we end up with is 2 spreadsheets that conglomerate all of that data together in one place. And there's quite a lot going on in those flows, so I certainly wouldn't recommend that you're running a flow like that too often. I think the standard limit, if you're using just an Office 365 license for flow, is 10,000 actions per day. I may have got that wrong, don't quote me on that. But certainly if you're dealing with a good number of webinars, then there are a lot of actions going on in that flow. And you could limit it a little bit by adding in some OData filters that would look at the last time that a record was modified, perhaps, based on when you last ran it. But just putting that out there to say, if you're going to do something like this, then you're going to create a lot of actions going on in Power Automate. So having built that out and run it, I ended up with my webinars and my attendees. So I was really very easily able to create this app where I just grabbed the information out of the webinar spreadsheet for this gallery and grabbed the information out the attendees spreadsheet for this gallery, and you can see that just filtering based on what's selected on the webinars side, I can get the attendees, and then jumping across to my second screen where I'm sending an email. The only thing that's kind of interesting about this is creating a filter for my attendees based on whether the checkbox on the first screen is evaluating as true or not, to get the correct list of attendees to go over to the email. And then this is just pushing that data over to Power Automate again, where it sends an email. But really, you could do anything with this. Once you've got that data in one place, the point is you can start to do things with it that it would just be impossible or very cumbersome to do when you've got that data broken down into lots of different lists. So bringing it all together, you could automatically add your registrants into a CRM system, for example, or you could you could send reminder emails on the basis of 2 weeks out, 7 days out, however you would do that. So the purpose of this is not to demonstrate a fully fledged app that does a lot of things. The purpose of this video is just to say, well, once you've got the data all in one place, it's possible to do something more with it than you are able to do out of the box with Teams. So that's really the app. And then that's kind of as far as I got with this, because the next thing that I wanted to look at as I came back to where we started, which was these attendance results, who has attended the event, and how long they've been there. And you can see that data does not exist in your attendees file, and it certainly doesn't exist in your webinars file, and it's not that we're failing to pull something across from the list either. You can see it isn't here. That data lives somewhere else, and actually based on the information, the links that I shared earlier, and I'll put those in the video description, you can see that some of the data sits within your Exchange mailbox. And there are these data points within the Graph API that enable you to grab information about online meetings. You can see here, and attendance reports related to online meetings. And so far as I can tell, this is the only place that this data lives. You can see an attendance report gives you this kind of information, gives you an email address, attendance in seconds, the ID, the identity of the person, and then we'll give you that information for everyone that's attended a meeting. And it's not particularly straightforward to get this data out of Graph because, firstly, this is reliant on a meeting ID, and the information that is stored in the lists related to your webinars does not contain a meeting ID. So how do you get a meeting ID? Well, there is this nice filter that you can do based upon the join web URL, which we do actually have for each of our meetings. So it is entirely possible to get the meeting ID from Graph using that join URL. So having that meeting ID, you can also get an attendance report. So I went ahead and I actually built a custom connector to query Graph from Power Automate, gave it the right privileges to access this information in Azure, and started querying it, assuming that these IDs here would somehow match the IDs that we have over here. But even for users that are inside your tenant, there is no correlation between this Teams webinar attendee ID and the ID that we see here in our attendance report. So, as I said at the start of this video, a lot of what we're talking about here is wholly undocumented, and there is not much documentation around this at all, and there certainly isn't any documentation of the way that Teams holds the data around webinar attendees. So I got to the point where, number one, in order to get this data, I would have had to use a custom connector. And using a custom connector obviously requires Power Automate licensing beyond the basic licensing that you get into Office 365. And as the point of this was kind of to see how we could extend Teams webinars without adding any licensing overhead, that didn't seem like the right course of action. But having built that custom connector just to play around with it and see what data I could get out of Graph, I was completely stumped as a method to connect together the data that I had in relation to the webinar and the data that I had together with attendance. So that's it really. So we have an app that will join together all that information. We have a flow that enables us to extract the information from webinars, and we can really extend the app that we've got or extend those flows based on what we want to do with that information. But we are sorely limited as to what we could do in follow-up. We can do whatever we'd like with that data in advance of the event. We know who was registered, we know whether someone has cancelled, so we can track that information, but we have no good way of tracking the information about who actually attended and joining it together with the information that we've got about who registered to begin with. So I think the last thing that I'll add is that if you're looking for a solution to do all of this out of the box, then Microsoft really does have one. It's called Dynamics 365 Marketing. And that adds in a lot of features, not just for webinars, but events generally, but helps you to manage your webinars and allows you to connect together the data that is around those webinars a little bit better than Teams does. As a default set of features. However, Dynamics 365 Marketing is pretty expensive, so there is probably a big audience of people who do have access to the webinars features in Teams who wouldn't, for whatever reason, have access to the features in Dynamics 365 Marketing. As I said at the start of the video, I certainly wouldn't suggest using any of what I've shown you today for anything that's mission critical or anything that's used broadly, but hopefully this has given you some ideas of how you can think about Microsoft 365 applications and the power of the Power Platform in order to help your productivity and to make jobs that you do manually or with a lot of interventions flow better and to be automated. If you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a like. If you're interested in seeing more content like this, then I would appreciate you subscribing to the channel. I'm certainly intending in developing more content along these lines. So thank you for being with me today. If you do know any more about the roadblock that I ran into with the graph, then please drop me a comment or get in contact some other way, as I would love to hear a solution to that. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.